Well, no, I'm just running 5 minutes late, but it's not too bad. Okay, so we're just going to start with panel 6 of the event. This is Intersection with Disability Studies. And starting us off is Christine with Deconstructing the Human Voice in 21st Century Animal Narratives. Thank you very much, Christine.
Thank you very much. So just want to check that the sound is okay. It's my first time using Teams, so just want to make sure. Okay, thank you.
Yes, that's right.
All right, thank you so much. So, and also thank you to all the organizers for organizing the event. There's been some really fascinating presentations. So I'm really excited to be sharing my research with you. And my research, so it's a work in progress, so all kinds of suggestions, feedback would be highly appreciated. And my work deals at the intersection between narratology, animal studies, and different disciplines. And today I'm going to be focusing on its intersection with disability studies. So my presentation would be roughly divided into 3 parts. The first would be on kind of the key relations between some kind of concepts that underlie my study. The second parts would be some examples of close analysis from my reading, which is Doglands by Tim Willock. So I'll also give a very short introduction to that book later on. And the third part would be trying to bridge the narratological structures that I've identified to contemporary society and actual life in the modern society. So starting with kind of the aim of my research. So the aim of my research is to unravel significant extents of which narratological elements, so stuff including like setting, plot, and characterization, so how they can be utilized to provide a concrete platform in which we can debate and question one's understanding of non-human disability. And I want to start by putting forward these 2 terms. So I'm sure everyone, of course, is very familiar with these 2 terms. So human and animal. So in the study of animals and non-humans, I think it's very common to come across these 2 terms. And it's also very obvious that there are some problems or issues that arise when we use these 2 terms together. So in contemporary society, it's very often we'll hear people say, human and animals, as if there's a kind of binary opposition between the 2. But there are definitely a lot of issues arising from this. So even from if we're talking about a scientific, point of view, humans are under the animal kingdom, so they're also a type of animal. So this kind of binary opposition there should not exist. And even if we're talking from a more philosophical or literary scholarly field, so for example, Carrie Wolf, she talks about the species grid, in which there are kind of 4 categories. There are humanized animals, there are animalized humans. So these are 2 of the categories she identified. And this also puts forward that there is actually not a very clear border between these 2 terms. So human and animal should not be distinguished as kind of these 2 categories, which actually puts them as very distinct categories. And this is very problematic, which comes to my next point. Again, with two different terms, so normalcy, disability. So these 2 terms are ones that often come up in disability studies, and also when we talk about animals in terms of disability studies as well. So what constitutes to normalcy? So what is considered normal? And most importantly, why is it considered normal? And on the other side of this is also disability. So what is considered disability? Why is something disabled or considered a disability? And is it that because something is not normal, it's considered a disability? Or because it's a disability, it's considered not normal? So there's this, all these concepts in play, I think, and this is something that underlies my research and something I like to explore when I look at my literature. And in terms of disability, I think it's in terms of my research, it's not just about missing a limb, or some physical disability, or even mental capabilities that are different. So I think there are other ways in which we can talk about disability, which I hope will be illustrated in the next part of my presentation, which would be my examples from my close analysis of Doglands. So Doglands is a novel that was published in 2011. So on the PowerPoint here is the book cover and the back of the book. And this is actually a crossover novel, so it's aimed at young adult. It's a contemporary young adult novel. It consists of 322 pages, 23 chapters. So it's not a huge novel. And it's been translated into different languages as well. So there's a German, there's a French, and there's an Italian edition. But of course, I'm only going to be focusing on the English edition. So pulling up this specific description or sets of kind of descriptions, if you take just a few seconds to read through these sentences here. So these descriptions were taken out from the first page of chapter 1 of this book. And it's regarding the setting of the book. So we see words like prison camp, boots and teeth and chains, hard and cold and damp floors, filthy troves of grub. So from this alone, we can already see, of course, a very negative mood that arises from this description. And I think these very vivid descriptions are very important in that they're vivid descriptions of the disabling conditions that the character. So Virgo here is the main character. He is the protagonist of the story, and he's also a canine. Okay, so he's a dog, and the book is told from his perspective. And from this description alone, I think it's very important in the sense that not only does it pave the way for the mood of the story that is to come, so it's also telling you they're confined in small cages against their will, they're forced to breed and feed. And this is very contrastive of the free roaming nature of their ancestors. So domesticated, they're being confined, which is not natural. And this poses this very important question, I think, in that are they disabled or are they made disabled? And I think this is something that is very interesting to consider in terms of when we talk about disability. So a lot of times I think when people talk about disability, it's talking about some more inherent characteristic or some physical characteristic that come with them or with a particular object or person. But then a lot of times, is it really that they came disabled, or is it some external factor, for example, or some confines, physical confines, environments or other people even that make someone disabled? And I think this is a very interesting question to consider when reading through this. And there are a lot of scholars actually look at this and they think that because a lot of times it's humans that are disabling other species of animals, therefore, even if an animal seems very vulnerable, it appears that they're very dependent on humans, but this should not be a reason to devalue their lives, because it's human convention or human intervention that has led them to such a disabled state. And I think this is illustrated very well by the descriptions that I've pulled up just now. And they are further illustrated through the narratological structures in which the writer presents their work. So in the descriptions just now, I said it comes from the first page, so first chapter, first page of the book. But right before that, the first words to come from in chapter 1 is once upon a time. So once upon a time is a very conventional fairy tale opening. So it's very familiar. It seems very calm and peaceful. Oops. And then the first few lines also introduce the first few weeks of the dog's life. So feeding on his mother's milk, there seems to be this very false sense of security that his family is providing. But then just after the first 3 or 4 sentences, the pace suddenly quickens. And that's where we see all the horrendous descriptions that I've showed you earlier on in this section. And this pace, this use of pace is used, I think, very deliberately to complement how quickly Virgo had to grow up into these really real life disabling conditions. And it provides a very vivid contrast, excuse me, very vivid contrast with the main story, which also complements the sense of urgency and approaching, danger that is to come. And not just that, but also the impact of, the very disastrous impact of human actions on depriving these dogs of a natural and dignified life. And I think the use of, for example, setting this narratological structure in this sense actually provides a very, very good base in which readers can actually debate on such issues of animal and disability. And I think this next example I'm going to give is also a very good a way of indicating this. So this is in terms of characters. So in the first chapters of the book, it's very interesting in the naming of characters. So the dogs themselves are called hounds, greyhounds, or mute, whereas the humans themselves are called masters. So the descriptions even are very contrastive between the two groups of characters. So for example, hungry, frightened, and sad are used to describe the dogs, whereas the masters are harsh, angry, and mean. And then the dogs also say there is no justice here. We haven't done anything wrong. And that the humans were bullies who thought it was fun to feel so powerful. I think these descriptions and the naming of characters is, again, very deliberate, deliberate choices by the author. And they foreshadow really this discussion of dominance and speciesism in the book. And of course, also the power dynamics. So we have the dominant master and then the oppressed greyhounds, which are under them. And this characterization, of course, is very common in different books where we have, a villain and the subjects, or the hero and the villain, and so on. But I want to bring out another point here instead, which is the downplaying of individuality. I think in using such way of identifying or categorizing the two groups of characters, I think there's actually a danger of really marginalizing and oppressing the species, because they're seen as this really faceless mass rather than as individuals. So in this sense, when they're generalizing, so greyhounds as hounds, as dogs, masters, humans as masters, this kind of generalization actually involves elevating the basis and privilege of those who are thought to be normal in a way. So in this sense, the author's use of these characters, or the naming of these characters in this sense, actually reinforces this very stereotypical image of normalcy, and also this hierarchy in which the disabled seem to be inferior and powerless, and the masters are the all-powerful who can do whatever they want to those who are powerless. So I think this is something I picked up, and I think it could be elaborated on a bit more. But in terms of, I'm aware of time, so I'm going to skip forward a little bit to how it bridges story to life. I think this is also an important part of my research, is how these ideologies that I've identified through the use of narratological structures, the writer's use of narratological structures, actually of course gives us a glimpse into a lot of anthropocentric ideologies, and they are very reflective of the contemporary society itself. And one particular one I'm just going to go through quickly is that of supply and demand. So dominant factors in determining the extent in which a society marginalizes and oppresses animals, I think, is very evident in this book, for example, in the use of greyhound racing as entertainment. So racers, for example, are justifiably commodified in the money-making business, and they're stripped of individuality. So they're just seen as greyhound racers, as dogs. And then they're also devalued into mere objects which are used for profit and money-making, and in extension becomes subjects of oppression. And in this sense, they're also being disabled by not just their masters in the book, but also by the general public, because of how they're being perceived, how they're being described, how their their personalities are given. And of course, there's a lot more to say about this when we read through the rest of the book. But I think if we strip down parts of the book, we can see there are a lot of different ways in which unraveling the narratological structures can actually help us see a lot more about how their platforms for disability studies. And I think by appreciating differences between species, we can actually reconsider these norms and recognize that the richness of individuality and diversity is something that should be valued and is very important in contemporary society. So I hope that has been a informative presentation regarding my research. So thank you very much.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that. And next up, we've got Jack Slater. Jack's a final year PhD student in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies in the University of Exeter. And whilst we're just a little bit behind time, I'll let the presentation and Jack speak for themselves. Thank you so much, Jack.
Hi everyone, I'm just going to try and share my slides. Give me 1 second, please. Oh my gosh, Teams is always a challenge, isn't it? Come on, we can go. We can do this. We can do this. We can do this. Do shout out if you can. Everyone see my slide? Give me a shout out. Give me a shout out.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right, that's great. I now, because of the way Teams works, I can't see any of you, so you're just going to have to shout out if something goes wrong. But I'll get started. And we'll make it work. We'll make it work. So hi everyone, it's obviously great to see you all. It's been a really fantastic symposium so far. I'm really glad that some of these have been recorded so I can go back to them. I think I've learned a lot. Really, really wonderful. So before I start, I think it's worth just very briefly situating how I'm coming into this paper and declaring maybe not a conflict of interest, but a professional complication that's worth flagging. So, as has just been mentioned, I'm at the very end of a PhD at the University of Exeter. In fact, I handed in my thesis just last week, very exciting. But I'm also a full-time campaigner with the animal activist group Animal Rising. So I coordinate their plant-based council's campaign. And this group sits in the more transformative liberationist space of animal advocacy. And the narrative that I'm going to focus on today, the Frankenchicken narrative, that's used primarily by the advocacy groups, the Humane League and Open Cages. And they sit in the more incrementalist, welfarist space of animal advocacy. And so while I am very much a fan of most of the work the Humane League and Open Cages do, I've worked with them before, I do have to admit a professional inclination to raise issues with their narrativization of their work and the non-humans they campaign for. And I just thought this was worth mentioning. And it's also worth pointing out.
Sorry, Jack.
Oh,
sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
I'm really sorry. I'm not sure. Have you moved off from the first slide yet?
I have.
Okay,
no.
we're still doing it. No, don't worry about it. I think it's how did we suss this yesterday?
I think you just need to, so Jack, I think you just need to share your whole screen rather than like your slides.
Okay. Let me
do, like,
stop
share
sharing.
Screen, that should allow you to share your whole screen and then put your slides up. And then
Yes,
we'll
yeah,
hopefully
there we
see.
go. There we go. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Oh,
thank
sorry
you.
to interrupt. Sorry.
No, not at all, not at all, not at all. Okay. I mean, the slides aren't very exciting, are they? So, you're not missing out on much. But anyway, so these narratives are really important in activist circles. I know we're all going to think this already. Why else would we be at this symposium? but I really can attest that animal activists are also super aware of the importance of the narratives that they construct and use in their work. So I just really want to like reinforce this sense that thinking seriously about the narratives that we tell of non-human animals, it's not an academic abstraction from the reality of animal activism. It's actually really, really valuable for the work itself. So then this specific narrative, the Frankenchicken narrative, the basic idea of comparing industrially reared broiler chickens to Frankenstein's monster reaches back at least to the early 2000s, but it's really built up currency in recent years through the work of the Humane League and Open Cages. And the essential content of this narrative is a contention that industrially reared broiler chickens have been bred to be so fast growing and so large that they have become monstrous in their form. Now, the more literary minded amongst you might be thinking that there's some exciting scope here for something interesting in this narrative with a sympathetic reading of Frankenstein's monster, but unfortunately not. In this narrative, we are encouraged to occupy the role of the Genevois residents who look upon the monster and feel a profound revulsion, an insistence that this being that we're seeing shouldn't be here. And this Frankenchicken narrative isn't confined to text. In fact, you could make a pretty convincing claim that insofar as this narrative circulates in popular consciousness, it's through visual media. I've got some examples on the screen here. When people who campaign with the Humane League or Open Cages engage in public outreach around this issue, the real central element is large poster boards that are plastered with images of these industrially reared broiler chickens, these Frankenchickens. And when the issue enters the media, it's often accompanied by either still images or video footage from these farms that really does emphasize the supposed monstrosity of these chicken bodies. There's a lot of focus on these splayed legs that many of these chickens develop as a result of their rapid growth. And there's also a focus on, because they have limited mobility, they often get ammonia burns from lying in their own waste. Now, I want to be really, really clear that I do agree with the basic thrust of this narrative, that the intensive rearing of chickens is pretty rubbish. It's pretty indefensible. You know, as I mentioned earlier, I'm an animal activist. Don't worry, I'm not giving here a defense of intensive chicken farming. Rather, my concern with this narrative, this Frankenchicken narrative, is that in the process of decrying intensive farming of chickens, it plays with, reproduces, and rearticulates some rather problematic narratives around disability that present real issues for thinking about both non-human animals and human beings. My worry stems from the fact that we can think of these chickens as experiencing something akin to human disability. Sonora Taylor, who sits at the intersection of thinking about disability and animal activism, writes quite powerfully about the disability of farmed chickens. And she's very careful to point out we should not easily equivocate between disability in human beings and disability in non-human animals. Indeed, as disability scholars have developed increasingly complex accounts of the social dimensions of disability, a crude method of pointing to, for example, a chicken that struggles to walk under its own power and a human being that needs mobility assistance, and saying that they're the same thing, that's obviously fatuous. If disability is primarily a social and relational phenomenon, then the disability of a Frankenchicken and the disability of a human person with a disability, they're clearly distinct. And yet, Taylor posits that we can productively think of these intensively farmed chickens as disabled. In the most basic sense, their bodies exhibit a mismatch between the capabilities that they should, according to the conceptual schema of an ableist world, possess, and the capability they actually do possess, in roughly the same way as is true for human beings with a disability. Moreover, if we think of disability as a social phenomenon, it's a materially embedded social relation that makes disability happen. When a building has steps to enter it and not a ramp, then that is not making a disability that already exists apparent. It is bringing it into existence. In the same way, the massive outsized bodies of Frankenchickens don't simply happen, but are the end product of complex social relations that constitute industrial animal agriculture. Now, there's loads more that could be said on this, and I do really welcome pushback on the idea of intensively reared broiler chickens as disabled. But I want to tease out the implications of this direction of thinking for understanding the Frankenchicken narrative. Thinking of these chickens as disabled casts this narrative in a new light. As I mentioned, the framing of these chickens in this narrative invites us to inhabit a space of disgust with respect to these chickens. And my concern is that this is operationalizing disability and directing a disgust through this narrative structure towards the bodies of the broiler chickens. And that's something I have an issue with. There's a sense, I think, that we're being asked to find these bodies repulsive because of their non-normativity and their inability to conform to the standards of what a healthy chicken should be able to do. And you can see, therefore, I'm sure, that if there is something of an isomorphism between the disability of non-human animals and disability as it manifests within human beings, this is clearly a deeply problematic position to inhabit. Now, to be clear, my contention is not that there's some kind of spillover from reviling the Frankenchicken into reviling human beings with disabilities, but rather that because such revulsion is clearly aligned with deeply misguided narratives when it operates in an anthropocentric framing, it suggests that a narrative that inculcates such revulsion towards non-human animals is also misguided. In really basic terms, I think it's probably quite bad to go ooh gross towards a body figured in terms of disability, human or non-human. So this is my problem with the Frankenchicken narrative. I should probably quickly sketch an alternative. Well, I don't actually have to, but I do, as according to my training, I count as a constructive theologian, so I probably can't leave my analysis finished at critique. Now, I'm well aware that I'm not a specialist in crafting a narrative that cuts through, so I don't think the sketch in the form I'm presenting it is viable on the tactical level, but my hope is that it has some salience on the level of strategy. Broadly speaking, I want to suggest that the Frankenchicken narrative, with its focus on the bodies of broiler chickens and overtones of revulsion, should be replaced by a more biopolitically inflected narrative that focuses on the systems of power that generate populations of chickens that lack certain capabilities. Here, I'm thinking of Jasper Poir's work on debility as it relates to the biopolitical management of the Gaza occupation, and also perhaps Achille Mbembe's necropolitical reading of the same. Now, again, I don't want to draw a loose comparison between the two. The people of Gaza are not chickens, nor are chickens the people of Gaza. To equivocate between the two, it's insulting to both. Now, Poir's conception of debility is a slow wearing out of populations. Populations as perhaps distinct from the bodies that constitute these populations into a perpetual state of debility. The temporality is different here. It's not chronic even. There's no before and after of the disabling event, but an atemporal assemblage that grinds down populations like water across rock. For Mbembe, necropolitics creates populations that are habituated to death and loss, in which the living have the condition of the living dead. There's something really resonant here with the Frankenchicken, but in a different form. It is a population that is the living dead, not the body. And I think it's fair to say that the very high rates of incidental death in industrial chicken farming, in the UK it's about 1 million a week, speaks to me of a population that's been habituated to death. Now, obviously, these are almost comically quick summaries of these two rich generative thinkers, but what they share is an emphasis on the interlocking systems and structures that create these populations. And while there's certainly a form of revulsion that's being operationalized here, when Mbembe describes death worlds, he's not doing so with a disaffected air. but the target of the revulsion is different. It's a revulsion at the economic and political and cultural mechanisms that create these death worlds. So what I suppose I'm saying, really, to try and wrap this up a little bit, is that I think a better narrative than the Frankenchicken is one that asks what kind of world creates these chickens in vast numbers? How is the life of broiler chickens as a population managed such that the populations are ground down whilst still alive? And I think there's like seeds of this narrative already there in the messaging around Frankenchickens. But I think it needs to be drawn out of it. It needs to be developed. Because I think it's often overwhelmed by a quite ableist notion of the Frankenchicken as a gross, deformed body. Now, how you craft this narrative in a way that fits on a flyer or a placard, I don't know. And maybe the problem is that there's a systemic issue with trying to get worthwhile narratives onto flyers. Maybe a good narrative is one that requires more than an A5 leaflet. But if we want to do more than just replicate the incipient ableism of the contemporary world in defense of broiler chickens, I do think we need a better narrative than what the Frankenchicken offers us. And I want to end very briefly with a final point about resistance and hope. Regardless of how we read Shelley's Frankenstein, the Frankenchicken is a hopeless and dejected figure. It's cursed by its very genes to live a life of suffering. Perhaps it's better off not as living dead, but just dead. But that's not really true of intensively reared broiler chickens. Yes, they do often have serious and chronic health conditions as a result of their genetic makeup. But despite this, they can, thrive outside of the contexts in which they're often reared. It's often not an able-bodied flourishing and able-bodied thriving. The legacy of their debilitation is worn deep. But it's still a form of flourishing, of a life worth living. And I think it's really important that we don't write off intensively reared broiler chickens as better off dead as a Frankenchicken, as a living dead. Because I think it's a really disempowering narrative, and one that's wrapped up with all kinds of unpleasant ideas about what constitutes a worthwhile life for both non-human animals and human beings. I think there is hope for the intensively reared broiler chicken, both as individuals and populations, and I don't think that this hope is visible when they're cast as Frankenchickens. So thank you very much for your time. I'm really looking forward to what else this panel has to say. Let me stop sharing my screen.
Thank you.
Paper. So I really resonated with when you said about the kind of quality of life, and how can we kind of play God with these things, because I think definitely in the sort of Frankenstein text, I think the true monster is actually Dr. Frankenstein, in that he abandons his creation, and this creation only wants to be shown love, and he repeatedly backstabs him in various ways. But it also, I'm a historian, so I'm kind of looking at disability studies from a kind of human perspective. And it's also got intersections with race as well. But I just wondered, I'm thinking a bit about sort of freak shows in the kind of 19th and sort of late 18th century, and how sometimes some of the exhibitions were non-human animals as well. So quite often I saw your image there of a co-joined animal. So that's quite a sort of popular one that was sort of viewed as, look at this exhibition, look at this freakery. So I just wondered if that kind of discourse and thinking of it from a historical perspective kind of influenced your work at all, or if you had any comments or thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really important insight, in terms of, I think it is picking up, though obviously it is being used in a different way. Like the people who are trying to use a Frankenchicken narrative in their activism, they're not saying intentionally, look at these quote unquote freakish animals, isn't that weird and what noteworthy? But my concern is that it's still picking up with those ideas. I think it does pick up some of that framing. I think one of the things we always have to be attentive to is that regardless of our like intentional our intentions when we're using narratives. Often it's narratives use us as much as we use narratives. And so I do think that there's definitely like themes of freak show that come up. And there's also, I didn't get into this, but there's also an impulse when investigators are investigating. Obviously, there's an incentive to find the most visually impactful chicken. And so that does mean you are essentially out, well, one is out trying to find a chicken that is particularly quote unquote freakish. And so I'm just quite concerned that essentially that it is a freak show just with additional layers added to it. So yeah, I think that's a really, really important point. Thank you for raising it.
Thank you.
I think, Jake, you've got a question in the chat? Yeah, Jake?
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. My question is also for Jack. I work on broiler chicken politics, so thanks. It was a really good presentation and it really opened some questions that I haven't thought about much, and yeah, it was really interesting. So thank you for that. I wanted to, yeah, I agree with you on the Frankenchicken narrative being, yeah, there's the overtone of bodily disgust is really grim, and I really liked your suggestion that it's for a biopolitical alternative. Like, there's a lot of work to do to turn that into flowerable stuff, but I think it's important work. Important work. The thing I'm struggling with is the disability aspect, because yeah, exactly as you explained, if disability is socially defined, I think there's a case to be made that actually within a system of capitalist production that where those chickens are, their primary social purpose is to produce as much meat as possible, broiler chickens aren't disabled because they fulfill that purpose. It's at the expense of lots of other aspects of their lives, but within that particular social configuration, they're not disabled. They're not defined as disabled in the same way, say, that someone who struggles with mobility is socially defined as disabled because it means that it makes it harder for them to interact with the world of work, right? If you take that kind of like really, yeah, capitalist construction of disability. So I wonder then if, yeah, if the kind of trying to define these chickens as disabled, because it's definitely an underlying narrative of loads of the activism is that, oh, they can't walk, they can't do this, that kind of construction of their disability. I wonder, yeah, if you had any thoughts on like where that, what's the social construction doing that work? Like, it's almost, it feels somewhat performative. It's almost like those chickens are disabled in terms of their ability to perform chickenhood for the consumer, like to feel better about consuming that chicken or something. I don't know where that construction is coming from.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an amazing point, and I think you're on one level you're absolutely correct, which is that if we're going to be serious about disability, in that it's a materially embedded social phenomenon, then yeah, obviously broiler chickens aren't disabled because disability is a category, a description. It is a social force that has been developed for human beings in particular contexts. So on one level, I think you're absolutely right, and there are real problems that emerge when we're loose about this, because you're also completely correct that actually the quote unquote disability of broiler chickens is in fact what makes them valuable to systems of capitalist meat production. So I think you're absolutely on the right line of where this is, where this the challenging element of this. And I'm not really sure what to do with that, because on the one hand there's the part of me that's an activist that notes that people resonate with this narrative. And that doesn't mean we should use it necessarily, but it does to some extent. It clearly activates part of the quote unquote general public's brain. And so there's something strategically valuable there. But then you're absolutely correct that it can reproduce these quite problematic notions of, you know, what is it that these broiler chickens are failing to do. I was sort of hoping, my hope is maybe to think about this more in terms of this idea of debility, and just completely like think about it differently in terms of it being about populations rather than bodies, and how that reframes the discussion entirely. But yeah, I think there are, you know, you've raised some really important challenges, and I wish I had an answer to you, but I don't. But I think there's a really valuable, and I'd love to think about that more.
Yeah, another question here. Sorry, yeah, you want to go first?
So it's okay. Thank you. Thank you to all of you. It was such an amazing panel. But my question is for Katrin, actually. And thank you so much for talking about Maudie. When I watched it, it was years ago now, unfortunately. I was so fascinated by how intimate this film is, and I just enjoyed it, and I went with the flow, and I just loved it. As you were speaking, it made me somehow think about another film. Weirdly, I don't think they're similar or like, but they share this the presence of a disabled person really focused on and passion. And I'm talking about Giovane Favoloso by Mario Martone, an Italian filmmaker. And but the difference, obviously, is that the person in Martone's film is Giacomo Leopardi, who is a writer and was suffered for arthritis, a very acute form, and he's one of the most famous poets in Italian literature, and the most studied as well. And he definitely dedicated his life to writing, to study, and had a massive library and blah, blah, blah. So I won't bother you with this, but it really resonated. I mean, the discourse you were making about Maudie's passion for painting. So I was wondering if you have reflected, or if you want to elaborate a little bit more on the passion for creativity as a gateway for like regaining some space in a socially constructed normality or in society. So that's my question.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you so much for the suggestion, because I haven't seen the other film, but now I'm really curious to maybe compare the two. So I'll definitely do that. Maudie's passion, I think it's really interesting how she, like, despite everything, goes for it, and that she takes so much strength from it, but also that she really does it for herself, actually. Like, she paints her home because she likes the way it looks. She feels like she has to do it for herself to be happy. And it's mainly her husband then that tries to make money out of it, but that she just does it because, yeah, she is so she can't do anything but actually paint. And yeah, I talked about this kind of with the screenwriter of the film, asking, like, yeah, why does she paint what she paints? Is it like also because she paints it in the world, she paints what she sees, but she does it in a kind of childish way, as people would say. Sherry White emphasized that it's just she just appreciates the beauty and the colors, and yeah, there's it comes from in herself, and yeah, I don't really know where I'm going with this, but yeah, if you want to steer me a bit in a direction. I don't know if I'm saying anything that is an answer to your question, but
No, thank you. It really did. Thank you.
okay, thank you.
Maybe we've just got time for one more question. Yeah, you have time or not?
Yeah. Hi, Katrin. I also have a very brief thank you, everybody. That was lovely, all the presentations. I have a quick question for you, Katrin. I haven't seen that film, so beautiful, and I will kind of watch it. It sounds really, was really interesting. I just wondered how, whether you had to think about the gaze, because, you showed quite a few good images where I was thinking about, how does the camera work? How does the gaze work? What kind of, in comparison to the classic male gaze, or kind of, how is that constructed? Have you looked into that, or is that something you might think is interesting to explore, especially in regard to, the material, the nature, the kind of surroundings? I just wondered whether there's something you have looked at, or you are interested in looking at, or how that could maybe as well work with disability. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I should look into that more closely before I can really give an answer to this question. But yeah, I liked, or I found it interesting how the movie kind of, tried to detach itself a bit from the human centrality, or the human perspective, but I think I should make a more detailed analysis also of like camera standpoints and whose perspective the camera is taking. Yeah, I'm still very much in the beginning of embarking on this research, so there's more work to do. Yeah, I can't. Yeah, I don't want to do any other. I don't want to say things that maybe are not argued well enough at this point. I don't know if you wanted to say something about a specific image that I showed.
I just thought it's fine, but I just thought, just in general, I think there's definitely something, just from the few images I saw, there will be probably something in that which will be really interesting, and it's absolutely fine if you haven't explored that yet. So thank you very much. But it's a fantastic film, it seems. So
yeah, it really is. It really is. Yeah. Thank you for your question.
All right, I think we'll wrap up with the panel 6 there then, but thank you so much for the fascinating discussion and questions. And yeah, we'll break for lunch now, and then if we can all reconvene in time before 2 o'clock with panel 7. There's a link for panel 7. Sounds good. All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.